So we're going to talk about government spending, one of the biggest issues politically, and it deals heavily with our national debt and our yearly budget deficits. So we can see from this slide where the money is being spent, at least from 2010, and it hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 5 years, but these will give you a general idea. Medicare and Medicaid, 23%, so that's really basically the largest amount of governmental spending on basically healthcare. Social Security or social net. Remember, these are entitlement programs for the most part. Medicaid is something that you have to qualify for, but it's not really an entitlement, but it's still being spent heavily. Net interest payments refers to how much we owe on our federal debt, and yet we've got to pay interest on those loans, and so we have to start paying those off at a certain clip. We currently spend at about 6%. The expense right now is about 20%, but we've been in a couple of different wars. That is dropping and has dropped back down a little bit in relation at least to the overall GDP, but it still is a big portion of what we spend money on. Other mandatory spending earmarks on different things like education and those kinds of things account for about 12%. And then discretionary spending, things that change annually based on what the president wants to do, based on what Congress wants to do, and what they can negotiate, and those kinds of things. That accounts for about 19%. Other mandatory spending might also, just to go back to here, salaries for governmental employees and different agencies. You got to pay Congress and the president and their budgets and all those kinds of things. When you account for all of the agencies and all the spending and all that kind of stuff that just has to happen, 12% is not all that much. Where the money is spent historically, early on, it was spent, we were spending a heck of a lot less. I mean, we still spent militarily and those kinds of deals. But what we started to see is, as we started to run into some of those major world wars and the Depression, things started to ratchet up. Obviously during First World War, there was a huge spike in spending. A pie chart on the military to deal with that. Kind of starts from the top, and it went from chunks. Social Security still 2% or say about 6% of our GDP so that's was government spending. War levels, but all the way up to 12%. We still currently have troops in many different nearly, pretty close after that. We hit the Great Depression, ratcheted up, and Roosevelt New Deal kicked in some spending, unemployment, welfare, other mandatory for social programs and safety net type things, and that really those kinds of things stuff up kind of to about 52% of spending, 12% on the gross domestic product or GDP. You combine these two, that's always actually kind of relation to that. Talk about health and human services. But it kicked way up. You throw World War II in there. Most of that spending, a bigger chunk, got diverted back to World War II and military. You can see all the other stuff, supporting the troops, where money. But every time you ratchet up with education, historical events, when you ratchet back down, you never ratchet back down to the level you were before the wars or before the Depression. Is where we typically you maintain that spending. We've got some issues there. Now, entitlements seem to be one of the areas where we spend most of our money. And remember, that's where, it says right here, federal money that is provided to those who meet eligibility requirements. So this does not include, remember, it does not include Medicaid, because that's a means-tested program, meaning you've got to qualify for it based on a certain amount of money that you're making and those kinds of things. All of this, though, has to get spent each year without congressional review, which means they can't adjust those numbers. They don't have any say over that. It pulls the money out of the general fund or the general pile of money, and so Congress has less discretionary use over that money because it has to get funded, which makes it tough. You can see examples of Social Security, Medicare, federal pensions, interest on the national debt. All those things have to get funded, whether the government wants to do it or not. So they don't have control over those dollars. You can see normally account for about 2/3 of the federal budget. That really makes it difficult. And when we look at the budget process, right, generally the president comes out with the budget. What they want to spend on that year, and that's based on political priorities and what the president and the political party basically think are the top priorities. There's a lot of different agencies that have to prepare their budgets. And generally what they do is they look at what they spent the year before, and they basically go off of that budget and they say, hey, did we have enough money? Did we have too much money? Generally, an agency never says, hey, we had too much money, please take some of this money away. So generally what you see is these agencies, once they are funded at a certain level, they will always make sure they spend all of their money to sort of justify having that amount, and then they generally always ask for more money the next year to boost programs and assist in what they've been doing. So you generally don't see those things get cut. Agencies never want to have their budgets cut. The Office of Management and Budget, they review all these requests, make recommendations to the president. Remember, the president isn't necessarily an expert on any of this stuff, so he goes off of a lot of these different numbers. But he has his political priorities, where he wants to cut, what he wants to boost. And so he just kind of goes off those recommendations. Once he reviews all of that, he submits a budget to Congress, right? Then Congress is going to take a look at that. The Congressional Budget Office, they want to look at it from their own point of view. When you have different parties controlling the executive branch and the congressional branch, they certainly don't want to rely on each other's numbers. They don't want to discount them either, but they at least want to check and balance each other out. So they kind of do an independent analysis of the president's budget just to make sure that they agree on the actual numbers and the facts that they're working with. A lot of times they don't necessarily agree with those. And so they have issues coming to agreement just on the basic facts of how much money is available and where to spend and those kinds of things. Then it goes into the different congressional committees, the Budget Committee, the Ways and Means, and the Appropriations Committees. This is where the money gets looked at, where it gets decided, where they're going to fund certain programs and those kinds of things. And then once again, that's where the politics comes into it, basically deciding whether or not the budget looks good or does not look good. Generally, this is a very cantankerous situation because you generally have, especially with a more polarized Congress, and it's very difficult to come to agreement on a lot of these things. You also have all of that input and lobbying from the different agencies. Some agencies want more money for certain programs, and they have to go and lobby for that. They don't want their budgets to be cut. They know if they need more money from someplace, somebody else is going to get cut. So it's a constant push and pull for them to try to negotiate and get more money, or at least maintain their budgets. You need a majority vote needed in both houses. This is not easy as well, because sometimes, the Republicans might control the House and the Democrats might control the Senate. And so you have issues there. Now, all of that has to get worked out. Makes it extremely difficult to get anything passed. On top of it, you have the Government Accountability Office. It's kind of a congressional watchdog agency that when groups or agencies, get the money that they get, that it is actually being spent as prescribed by law. And we know what happens when we don't believe that agencies are spending the money based on the intent of the legislation. Then you have hearings and you have investigations and all those kinds of things. You can, threaten to pull money away from different agencies the next year, if they're not kind of going by the intent of what you're trying to do. So you get a lot of that going on. The political influences that go into this are great, as you can imagine. Just political party differences plays into this. Republicans generally want to cut taxes, and they also want to cut entitlement programs and those kinds of things to some degree. They want to increase military spending usually, where the Democrats kind of go in the opposite direction of that, right? They want to bolster entitlement programs and social welfare type programs, and they want to cut defense spending. And so that has to get worked out. You have all the different interest groups and PACs. that provide input, provide expertise, provide lobbying, and all that to try to win, win money in essence for their constituencies. That goes into it. The old iron triangle where you have, legislators and their agendas. A lot of those agendas will be enforced, or how successful those agendas will be are based on how much money they can give to the correct agencies. If the agency uses it well, then that looks good for the legislator. So there's kind of a relationship there. You've got the PACs that are involved in that, and kind of the special interests that provide input and information on how that money should be spent as well. So all that comes into play. And then on top of it, a lot of times what you see is, public opinion, right? We know that politicians don't always follow what the public wants, but they have to play by public opinion to some degree, especially during election seasons. If they upset their constituencies, then it makes it more difficult for them to get reelected. And so they have to at least look at what the public actually wants to do. And we've read a couple articles that basically says a lot of times they try to sway public opinion as opposed to pay attention to what the public wants and then go with that. Presidential action, right? Once it gets through both houses, then it moves back to the president. He can either sign it, and then it becomes the budget, or he can veto it. We used to have a line item veto, but that became much too political, and people were worried about the power the president would have over that process. They got rid of the line item veto. And so now he either signs the whole thing or he vetoes the entire bill, and it has to go back through the process, and they have to come up with something new. If the president does veto the entire thing, you've got Congress can always override it with a 2/3 vote. However, that's difficult to do. It has happened in the past. It just doesn't happen very often, and you can imagine how difficult that would be. But then it just goes back through that process once again. One of the big issues of today, deficit spending, right? You have these large budget deficits when you don't pull in as many taxes as you are spending, right? And so you're running what we call in the red. And every year that you do that, it adds to the national debt. And that becomes a problem, right? Because you always have to pay interest on that national debt. And the more debt you have, the worse things seem to be for your economy and for your overall health of your economy. And so we have to pay attention to this budget deficit. The national debt is an accumulation of past budget deficits. And sometimes people get this confused. A budget deficit is what you do on a yearly basis. The national debt is the accumulation of all the debt from all the years that you've had debt. So some years we run with a budget surplus, right? And that'll actually reduce the national debt to some degree. And that's a good thing. It never generally wipes it out. We always run with some sort of debt, and that's actually fairly healthy to do. It's just you don't want your debt to be too high. What we started to see were huge budget deficits during the 1980s. This is the Reagan years. It's interesting to me that Republicans talk about fiscal responsibility and cutting taxes and reducing the size of government as one of the major platforms. And they always look to Reagan as one of the greatest fiscally responsible presidents. But yet during his tenure in the 1980s, we went from about $200 billion per year, that he was running these deficits, and basically tripled the national debt from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. It was a lot due to he had some massive tax cuts, mostly at the high end for the wealthy, and then he also increased defense spending. And so when you cut the amount of money you bring in and you increase how much you're spending, you're going to run massive deficits. And so that was a big issue. In 1990, to kind of curb some of this, Congress and Bush, this is Bush Sr., agreed on a pay-as-you-go type proposal where if you can only increase spending if it's offset by either higher taxes or you have spending cuts in other places. And that's where it kind of became the big issue of, well, where do we want to cut, right? If we're going to cut, you either cut military or you cut social welfare programs. Can you cut Social Security? Do you cut back on education? All of those are big issues that nobody really wants to cut. And so it makes it tough. Republicans certainly don't want to cut the military. So that kind of agreement expired in 2002, just as President George W. Bush was coming into office, or had been in office for a couple of years, but was really starting to get things going. In the mid 1990s, based on budget, they actually shut the government down. That was very hurtful to the Republicans because you had President Clinton in, he was a Democrat. You had the Republicans in control of Congress. They shut it down and it really hurt them politically. And so they realized shutting the government down was not a good political move to hold kind of the government hostage on that situation. The government was shut down for close to 3 weeks, and people weren't receiving paychecks and Social Security payments weren't going out and all those kinds of things. It was a pretty tough deal. Currently, our national debt, right, at least in 2010, now exceeds 10 trillion. Until 2002, that was a fairly reasonable amount compared to GDP, but that is no longer true. 10 trillion, that's a lot. Today, it's closer to $19 trillion. So things have really gotten a lot worse. Economists and a lot of people are upset and worried about that. It's still fairly low compared to our GDP, which is good, but the number seems really high, so it becomes a political issue. Congress has never been able to pass a balanced budget amendment where you have to balance your budget every year, and that has been a bit of an issue. And when you look at Keynesian economics, where during years of recession, the government needs to spend money to stimulate the economy. That becomes tough. They also believe that there were a lot of ways in which Congress and the president can work around even a balanced budget amendment and make it basically invalid. So they never were able to get anything like that passed. You had some era under the Clinton administration where we were actually running surpluses. And so then the question became, what do you do with that extra money? Republicans favored tax cuts. Democrats wanted to bolster the social welfare programs, the Social Security that were struggling and wanted to do that. So they had differences in how to spend that money. What Bush did is he decided when he came into office that we're going to use tax cuts. And people got literally checks in the mail as a tax rebate because we had too much money. Sorry about that. And then all of a sudden we were attacked at 9/11. We got a war. We still continue on with our tax cuts, but now we have these massive wars. And so, there go the budget surpluses, and you have massive increases in spending for military. And that became a bit of a problem. And so what happens is somebody buys up our debt. China right now is the largest holder of our national debt, and that's a problem. They're starting to struggle as well, so that's a bit of an issue for them. But one thing to keep in mind, the difference between the national debt versus the deficit. National debt, how much money we owe in total for all of the years we've been in existence, versus the deficit, what we do on a yearly basis. Are we spending more than we bring in taxes?